What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Classic Octane. I am Taylor. So in the last video you saw me get a classic CB750 running again. At the end of that video I was kind of going back and forth of what to do because we discovered we had one cylinder of that engine that had low compression. So my original plan was to just take one of my other CB750s, get that running, see if that engine was in good shape, swap the engine in and be good to go. But I listened to a lot of your comments and decided to do what you guys would do. Most people in this scenario are not gonna just have a spare CB750 laying around like I do to swap it in. So we decided we're actually going to do a top end rebuild. So I have the full top end rebuild kit, including new piston rings, all the gaskets, all the seals, everything to do basically from this section all the way up. So that's gonna be the name of the game today. This isn't gonna be a how-to video on doing this process. It's gonna be more of an overview of me doing it, and let's see if we can discover what's causing our low compression on the number 4 cylinder. Let's tear this thing apart. Before I get started, I'll give you a quick rundown of all the parts we have here. So this is a complete top end gasket set. I'll throw a link to all this in the description below, but it has all the head gaskets, valve cover gaskets, exhaust, I mean everything we can think of. 4 sets of new piston rings, spark plugs, and then I went ahead and got one of those stainless steel Allen bolt kits. This engine actually has all stainless steel Allens already. The main ones I like to replace are these on the valve cover, just because these, you know, it needs to be a nice, even, like solid seal across here, and it's a little bit difficult to do that with these JIS screws. So I like to just replace them with Allens, and then of course the whole engine will match now that it'll be Allens all the way across. So that should be everything we need. I'm gonna go ahead and start to pull stuff apart. I'm using my second lift here as a workbench to keep all my parts nice and organized. Got the valve train all removed. It doesn't matter how many times you've done this. It's never a bad idea to just have the manual, just to keep your sanity, keep, you know, the process down of each individual step, and just, you know, make sure you're not getting ahead of yourself. Also, it's very important to kind of meticulously lay everything out, like your rocker shafts and everything, to make sure that you're not losing any bolts, you're not putting any bolts in the wrong place. You know, all the rocker shafts and rocker arms and everything are all going back where they came out. So I like to just kind of methodically lay everything out. That way it's very simple for me to just kind of reverse order. So I'm to the point now where I'm going to be loosening all of the head bolts, or nuts I should say, and it's very, very important that you do this slowly. And what I'm going to do is just do reverse order of what the manual calls for tightening them. And it's going to be like a crisscross kind of pattern. I don't remember what it is offhand. Again, why I have the manual out. But again, it's very important to not just loosen all of these in one go. You want to just crack them loose in reverse order and keep loosening until they're all nice and loose. And what that does is evenly releases the pressure of this head. If I just started from this side and started unbolting everything, the head would start to lift on this side while being stuck down, and that can actually warp the head. So I can't stress this part enough, to just go nice and slow, reverse order from what's in the manual, and then we'll pull all these off. We'll be ready to pull our cylinder head off. All the bolts are out, nuts are out, should be ready to remove. Work it over all the studs. We need to feed our, there we go. And there she is. Definitely got some buildup on the valves, that's for sure. We'll want to clean that up a little bit. Overall, it doesn't look bad. Looks like I'm missing a little O-ring or two, but luckily we got new ones. Okay, let's put that like here. So our number 4 is a little bit rusty, which is what I was thinking was the problem in that last video. If you remember, I was thinking that some water probably got into this cylinder a little bit and either caused some rust issues on the valves or, you know, caused some rust on our piston rings, something like that. I believe I had it in time-lapse mode, so we may have missed me pulling the cylinders off, but there's no more bolts or anything. It literally just pulls off right after you pull the head off. So looking down in here, this is our number 4 cylinder. It's definitely got a little bit of corrosion on it. It's a little bit dirty, but I don't feel any like heavy scoring or anything like that. So I truthfully believe that that will come right back with a hone. I don't think we're going to need to do any kind of machining or, you know, boring it out a little bit. It's nothing that's that kind of damage that we'll know for sure when we hone it, but it looks pretty darn good. I'm going to go ahead and run the hone through all of them just to get a nice cross hatch and everything back in the rest of these. But one thing I did notice, and so, okay, number 1 cylinder right here, the piston and the piston rings, you can see the piston rings are loose in their ring lands. They're kind of they're able to float around, they're springy a little bit, so they actually spring out when it's in that cylinder, push against the cylinder wall, and give you good sealing, aka good compression. And they're nice and free on all of these pistons, except for number 4, which is our problem cylinder. You can see the rings are completely stuck in their ring lands, like they're not even pushing out anywhere, which is exactly what I would hope to find for a engine that had just low compression, not no compression. So no compression, we would expect to see a hole in a piston, a bent or broken valve, some like heavy damage. But since it was low, we're like, okay, it's probably not catastrophic. And this is exactly what we're finding here. Is it looks like water probably just got in the cylinder, ran down the side of the piston a little bit, caused these rings to get seized tight, close together, and we're just not getting a good enough seal. Truthfully, if you're just a little shade tree mechanic, you probably free these up, slap this thing back together, and it would probably run perfect. Since I'm in here, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and replace these with our new rings since I have them anyway. I'll probably go ahead and replace all of them just so we have fresh rings throughout the whole thing. What I do want to look into now is the best way for me to start cleaning all this stuff up. The pistons themselves, I can pull them out, and truthfully, I'll probably vapor blast them. Some old timers are going to get really mad if I do that, but vapor blasters are not very aggressive, and they will not take away metal, which means we should be able to blast this carbon off and leave a nice clean finish. Vapor blasting is used on internal engine parts all day, every day, no problem. That being said, I don't want to vapor blast the head because these are really easy for me to clean afterwards. I can clean all the glass bead out, blow it with compressed air, you know, wash them off, make sure there's absolutely no remnants of glass bead or anything on the piston itself. That's not going to be easy for me to do on the cylinder head, just because there's way too many cracks and crevices for glass bead to get stuck in. So I'm going to try and figure out a different way to clean up this combustion chamber, clean all this carbon buildup and everything out, but I'll bring you guys back when I figure that out. You can see I've cleaned one side, and all I'm doing is using a little bit of solvent, spraying it in here, letting it sit for a little bit. Then I'm using some Scotch-Brite pad. You can use a bunch of different stuff for this. Just don't use anything that's stronger than aluminum. You know, you don't want to get in here with a razor blade and start scraping too crazy, or some heavy duty steel brush or something like that. You just don't want to be able to scratch or gouge any part of this because you can create kind of a hot spot and some issues. This is a very, you know, finely machined surface, and you just don't want to introduce any extra kind of nicks or anything. So I'm going through here, again, just letting it sit for a little while, scrubbing it. I am using a little brass brush. If you're gentle with that, it's fine. Scotch-Brite's working well, and cleaning it all up. I'm also doing the same thing on the pistons as well. I was curious of how deep that carbon buildup was, but really spray with solvent, rub with a Scotch-Brite, and it all came right off. So I don't think we're going to have to vapor blast anything. So I'm going to be doing that, and then I'm also going to be working on mating surfaces for head gasket, cylinder base gasket, all that stuff. We want to make sure everything is super clean. We also want to make sure that all these little O-rings and everything are accounted for so that we can replace them with the new ones when everything, you know, is going all back together. So I'm going to keep scrubbing. We're going to move on to this side, and I'll clean up the pistons, and I'll bring you guys back when I have everything clean and we're ready to put our new piston rings on. Making some good progress here. Got all my surfaces cleaned up, again, just with some solvent, some Scotch-Brite, and everything came out pretty darn nice. I'm happy with that. So I went ahead and pulled out one of our pistons as well. This is the one that had the stuck rings in there. I was able to get them out very gingerly, and they broke, and they were definitely corroded in there. But there doesn't seem to be any damage whatsoever to the ring lands or the piston itself. So I have no reason to think that these need to be replaced. Everything seems to be good, cleaned up nice. There's a little bit of discolorization, but this is very smooth, which is what you're looking for. You just don't want this to be pitted or any kind of, you know, big gouges, anything like that. That's just going to become a hot spot and could potentially become a problem. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to go ahead and double check the ring gap on all of our new rings. I already honed these two cylinders. I'll show you guys the honing process on these two here in just a minute. But while I was doing this, I figured I'd turn on the camera so I don't get too far ahead of myself. So there's three, we'll call them sets of rings. The top two are just individual rings. The bottom is what's called an oil control ring, which has this little kind of springy corrugated looking piece in the middle, and then two thin kind of retainers on each side. So that makes a little sandwich, and that's what actually keeps the oil on the bottom side of the piston, scrapes it off the cylinder walls. And then you have these two, which are very, very similar, but if you look at the profile, one of them has just slightly rounded over corners, and that's going to be your top ring. So consider that number one. This one happens to be kind of a two-tone color. It's got like the silver on the edge where it's a little bit closer to black on the surfaces. This one is a solid black. This is going to be our number two ring, which is almost perfectly square on the edges. And then also they have little markings. These have little R's on them. That goes up. So that just kind of keeps, you know, it'll be in this configuration when it's on the piston itself. We'll also want to make sure that we clock these gaps so that two gaps don't match up together, because that becomes a potential spot for compression to kind of leak by. So we want them about 120 degrees apart from each other whenever we go to install them. But what I'm doing now is double checking that ring gap. And if you're not familiar with how to do that process, I'm going to kind of just gingerly put it into the cylinder here. I'm going to take our piston upside down, and I'm going to push it down, you know, maybe about a third of the way. I like to use the ring lands on the piston to make sure that I have this perfectly square in the bore, just like that. So I'm basically just pushing it down until the cylinder surface matches all the way around that bottom ring land. Then what I can do is take my feeler gauge and go in here and measure that little gap. And what I'm personally shooting for is about 12 thousandths of an inch gap. The spec in the manual is it only tells you the maximum spec. It says if it's bigger than 27 thousandths of an inch, replace the rings. There is a lot of speculation on the internet about what they should be set to when you're going in fresh. I've seen as tight as 8, as high as 18. I figure I'm going to meet in the middle, and I'm going to shoot for 12 thousandths, which surprisingly and luckily is exactly what these are measuring out at. So I'm just sticking that in there. 12 thousandths of an inch tells me that we don't have to do any filing on this. If that was super tight, say there was no gap or there was 2 thousandths of an inch or something, you can file these rings, and you just want to make sure you kind of evenly take off very small amounts and just work your way up to whatever spec you're shooting for. I'm sure someone in the comments will tell me that 12 thousandths is the wrong thing, but we're gonna do it anyway. So I'm gonna keep going, and I'm gonna just spec each piston ring to each cylinder. So these will become this cylinder's rings, and so on and so forth, just in case there's little variances in bore size. We don't throw ourselves off. But that's how you check piston ring gap. I'm gonna show you guys quickly how I hone these cylinders. So I'm gonna get a little bit of lubricant, and then this is the hone that I have. It's just a 3-stone kind of spring-loaded piece you put into a drill so that you can stick this in the cylinder. It will evenly press out, and then you can turn the drill on, run this. It does not take a lot. We're not trying to remove a ton of material here. All we're trying to do is clean up any little spots of corrosion, and then introduce what they call a crosshatch pattern, which is basically fine scratches in an X pattern that just help with compression. They help with those rings to have something to kind of bite onto to seal nicely. So I'm just going to spray a little bit in there, nothing crazy. Stick our hone in. Don't go too far. We'll wipe it out. We'll see how that looks. Not sure if you'll be able to see, and it probably looks a little more aggressive than it is in person. We don't want to be able to feel any of those marks or anything. We just want a nice light kind of X pattern scratches, for lack of a better word, down the cylinders. Make sure there's no heavy buildup, anything like that, and that's it. So you're literally talking about maybe 10, 15 seconds tops on the honing process. Again, less is more. I'd rather go back and do it 3 or 4 times instead of do it too far and end up, you know, kind of boring the cylinder out unintentionally. Knock out the last one. We're ready to keep going. Got number 4 with the new rings in place. Figured I'll show you here on number 1. Just go through it one complete time for you guys. So I got my number 1 rings here. We'll pull off the old ones. Again, keep in mind, piston rings are very brittle. So if you bend them too far one way or the other, I'll just show you on this one. If you bend it too far, it'll explode into a million pieces. And I probably should have worn some eye protection before doing that, but luckily we are good to go. So keep that in mind. Do not go crazy when you bend these things to get them off. You just get one edge, work your way around, just slow and steady. And make sure, again, you're not gouging anything, you're not scratching it up, and you can just pull them off. They're all going to be garbage. These little oil control ones can be kind of a pain, but you just find the area where the gap is, and you can generally get a little nail in there and separate it out. Like that. We'll find the gap on this corrugated piece, which is right here. And it's out. You can pull the pistons out to do this if you want. I'm just going to do it with them on the connecting rod still, just so that it kind of helps support it. So when we're going back on, we're going to do the oil control ring first. Slide it around, get it in that very bottom slot. And then we have our 2 little thinner rings that go on the top and bottom of that. Boom. That one is in. So kind of spin it around, make sure everything's moving nice and free. Everything's where it should be. And we can move on to the next one. You remember from just a second ago, it's the one with the perfectly square edges. In this particular case, it's the one that's one solid color. We want to make sure our little mark is facing up. We'll work it around, not bending it too much. Number 2 ring's in place. We're going to set that gap right over here about the 4 o'clock position or so. And we'll go for our top ring. We're going to want to set that gap about 120 degrees off. So I'm going to shoot that for, I don't know, somewhere around this 7 o'clock area, 7, 8 o'clock, something like that. Just, you know, a decent amount of distance. You don't want the gaps right in the front or right in the back of the piston either. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but the manual does say that. And there we are. So all of our rings are in place, the gaps are staggered. We're ready to move on. Rinse and repeat. Now that all the piston rings are in place, we are ready for reassembly. I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but my cam chain tensioner is in good condition. This would be a good time to replace those wheels if they are heavily worn out or, you know, have any kind of issues. They're like $15. It's not a bad idea to do them. Mine, like I said, is in good condition. I honestly think that this engine was apart not all of that long ago, because almost every single gasket surface, the gasket just came right off. If it's like an original, you know, 40-plus-year-old engine that's never been opened before, I have to do so much scraping and so much more cleaning to get the gaskets off. This one, the gaskets came off, so I'm thinking probably, I don't know, the last decade, 15 years maybe. This engine's probably been apart before. So here's all of the O-rings and gaskets and everything that come in your top-end gasket kit. They're all pretty self-explanatory. I'll just kind of go through really quick. These are 4 really thin O-rings. Those actually go on the bottom of the cylinders right around here. You can actually see the old O-rings in those little grooves. So that's where those 4 O-rings go. Next, we'll just move on to these. These are for our tappet covers. So they replace the O-rings in here. Exhaust gaskets are the copper ones. We have these kind of thicker, more of like a cylinder type O-ring. Those go around here. There's 4 of them right on the top of the cylinders, and they meet up with the cylinder head in these 4 holes there. 4 just actual O-rings that aren't, you know, as thick. Those go, 2 of them go right here and right here. You can see the little recess in there. And then on the other side, oh yeah, on the block itself is where the other 2 go, right here and right here. So you can see where those 2 studs have kind of a little recessed area. That's where those 4 O-rings go. The 4 smaller O-rings go on the top side of the cylinder head. Replace these little O-rings right here. So there's one right there, one right there, there, and there for oil passages. These little hockey puck looking discs are for covering up where our cylinder head actual nuts go through, or bolts I should say. So that's where those go. And then of course you have your main cylinder head gasket, and then bottom, this greenish one, that is your cylinder base gasket, which goes between the block and the cylinders on this side. Cylinder head gasket, of course, goes between the cylinder and the head. That's very obvious. This one, the thinner one, is your valve cover gasket. And then you have things for like the starter motor and your cam chain tensioner, that kind of stuff. So all of that was probably self-explanatory, but if anybody's never done this before, it can look a little intimidating, but it's really not that many gaskets. You just kind of look for where the same size is, the same number of O-rings, and swap it out. So I'm gonna go ahead and start to throw all those in. I'll bring you guys back when we are placing the cylinder head back on here, because it can be a little bit tricky to get all of the pistons into the cylinders at the same time, making sure we don't catch and break any of our piston rings. There's a bunch of different theories on the best way to do this. I've done it a bunch of different ways. Just gonna make sure that all my ring gaps are set again. Okay. I've seen people put pieces of wood under here to support the pistons. There's piston ring compressors you can put on here. I find them more of a pain than help on these engines. If you think about like building a small block Chevy or something, these cylinders are built into the block. So when you put the piston in, you just compress it, slide the piston in, and then your piston ring compressor tool is just like on the top and just comes right off. The tool is kind of going to be stuck in the middle there, so you got to use like a hose clamp or something. Anyway, long-winded explanation of I'm not going to use one. I'm just going to kind of manually, manually put them in. There is a little taper on the bottom of each one of these cylinders that can kind of help you get the piston rings to slide up in there. Takes quite a bit of finessing and patience, but it's really not too bad. Pull our cam chain through here. Make sure our cam chain tensioner and everything is in the hole. We'll just start to line these pistons up to each cylinder, like so. Then we're just going to go cylinder by cylinder and next up, we make sure that all of our O-rings are in place. We got our kind of cylinder O-rings and then our standard O-rings. Make sure you have your little dowels on the outside. Cam chain tensioner, all that's in the right spot. We'll go through with our brand new cylinder head gasket. Making sure we don't bend this thing too much one direction or the other. And these go on without any kind of copper spray or anything. Copper spray is for copper gaskets. These are graphite, I believe. Just gotta fit it over this little dowel like that. Go. Should sit nice and flat. And we are ready for our cylinder head. So it's going to go on the same way. We just need to make sure we feed this cam chain all the way up through. There. Mating surface is clean, no O-rings or anything left in place. Kind of hold it up while I feed this chain through the tunnel here. We're not pinching anything. Got a bunch of studs to line up, so. Just like that. Nice and flat, seated around. No issues. Got our cam chain through. And that like here. Okay. Now we're ready for the 4 JIS, I'm going to call them, bolts that go through these 2 holes, and they do get those little hockey pucks as well. There actually isn't any bolts through these center ones, but we'll put the little blinking plugs in there as well, just like this. Keep everything nice and sealed. So we'll throw these in, and they just get tightened down. I don't actually know if there's a torque spec for this or not. I'll have to look it up. The really important torque spec is for all 16 of our head nuts that go through here, and that's where we follow that sequence, and we'll kind of hand tighten them all, and then we'll lightly snug them all up, and then we'll probably work through either 1 or 2 sequences of torque. And I gotta look up what the setting is. It's not a ton. It's somewhere on like 15, 18 foot-pounds, something like that. But what's most important is that we follow that pattern so that we get a nice even clamping load across the entire head. Little seals are in place, everything's nice and torqued down. So right now I want to double check that our cam, well, 1, that the engine turns over nicely, 2, that our cam chain is still on the sprocket. So yep, moving. Seems to be moving nice and smooth. It's not super easy to move, so we know that seems to be having, you know, good contact with the sides of the cylinders as much as we can tell. I'm also going to take this opportunity to go ahead and get the engine in the right spot to install the cam, which is the T mark on the timing plate over here for the 1 and 2 cylinders. So that's top dead center for 1 and 4, I mean. So we'll put it right on the T mark right there. So that means number 1 and number 4 are at absolute top dead center, which is where our cam needs to be installed. We're ready to go for our cam retainers, whatever these are officially called. Just slide down on their little studs. Gotta look it down on it. You can do it. Ah, I see our problem. Our old little seals are stuck on there. We don't need those. There we go. Now we slide her on. It goes much better. See, it just goes to show, don't get ahead of yourself if something's not fitting right. Just take it off and double check it. Okay. I don't know if I mentioned this when we took it apart or not, but our cam bearings look to be in really good shape. There's no scoring or any kind of excessive heat. We'll kind of discolor them. Okay, looking at my manual here. Slide these down, rotate. Cylinder 1 forward on the timing mark. Okay, now we're ready to put the cam back in. So put it back in. We need to slide it through the cam chain. Being careful not to nick any of the lobes here. Just work nice and slow. Go ahead and remove my welding wire. About Okay, so now let me show you on this side the little marks that you got to make sure are lined up. So on the side of the cam here, you have this little keyway, and then you have these two lines. We want that keyway to be in the 12 o'clock position, so straight up. And then I'll have our two little lines matching with that cam retainer right there. So that's exactly where we want the cam to stay. And so you have to be very careful that it stays in that position and that you can get this cam sprocket installed without moving that cam too much. So we'll put the cam chain on the sprocket, we'll hold it up in place. See, I think, because if I were to bolt the cam up, I would have to move it just like that. And that's a little bit off, I think. Let's try to move the sprocket one tooth. Boom, right there. So we were one tooth off, and that can throw your timing way off on your bike. So hopefully that all makes sense of what I just did, of playing with that cam sprocket while you're installing it, making sure the cam doesn't move, and that you can put the chain on, put the sprocket up onto the cam where we took out our two bolts earlier, and that everything is nice and lined up. No issues to report. We're ready to throw those two 10mm bolts back in here and actually bolt that sprocket to the cam for good. Knocking out the rocker shafts now. It's just a reverse of how they came out. They're just sliding from the side. The outside is slotted so that you can use a flat blade screwdriver to orientate them, easy for me to say, so that you can get these little bolts in there. And I'll have to look and see if these have a torque spec. I know the top of the cam bearings, the cam bearing caps, have a torque spec, but I don't know if these do or not. Now's the time to go back on our bearing caps. And these do get torqued down to, what does the book say, 6.5 to 9.5 foot-pounds. So I'll run through and throw all these on, tighten them up. And I think the next step's probably our cam chain tensioner. We'll have to see when we get there. Ready for the cam chain tensioner now. So we just have our 3 bolts. This thing is super simple. It's basically just spring loaded. So you undo the lock nut, compress the spring down, lock it in place for installation. We're gonna put our new gasket on here. Go ahead and start our 3 bolts through just to keep our gasket aligned. And just slides right in. And we'll tighten our bolts down. Once the bolts are tightened down, we can undo that lock nut and it will spring into place, setting our chain tension at exactly what it needs to be. Moving on to valve clearance now. So to get the engine in the right position, basically you turn the engine clockwise until you see this number 1 intake valve go down and then come back up. Then you align your T mark with a little notch on the block. Now that's in the correct position for us to do intake and exhaust on number 1, as well as exhaust on number 2 and intake on number 3. And we're looking for 2 thousandths on the intakes, 3 thousandths on the exhaust. We're then going to turn the engine 360 degrees, line that mark up again. That's going to allow us to do both of them on number 4, as well as intake on 2, exhaust on 3. Hope that makes sense. It's all in the manual. So I'm going to knock out all the valve clearance, and then we should be ready for our valve cover and our breather. Now we're ready for the valve cover. I like to just hit everything in here with a little bit of oil One, because this engine's going to be sitting for a couple of weeks before it's run. And then two, everything's really dry now. And on initial startup, wouldn't mind it just being a little bit more lubricated. So that's good, nothing crazy. Got a fresh gasket on there. Time for our cover. And I do have all of my new Allen bolts in here as well. Just like that. We'll just start to kind of run these down. I'll kind of run them down in a crisscross pattern. It's not as critical as like bolting down the head, but it just keeps everything from tweaking or getting kind of warped or lopsided. So I'll run all these down. Then we're ready to throw on. I'll throw on the breather anyway. We'll have to take it back off to actually get this engine back in the frame, but just so nothing falls down in here, we are going to give this engine a nice clean, light paint job just to kind of freshen it up. And I want everything to be nice and sealed. And there is a new O-ring in the kit for the breather cover as well. Don't forget that. And the final step is our 8 O-rings on our Tappet covers. Just use a small flat blade to pull them out. Slide the new one on. Tighten them up. Well, that's it for the 750 top end rebuild. As you can see, it's really not terribly complicated. If you just work methodically, place all your pieces out in the order that they come out of the engine, follow the manual, follow this video to somewhat. Like I said, I didn't really want to do a how-to video, but I wanted to kind of show you the important parts. It's not terribly complicated. I really do hope that this kind of demystifies the top end rebuild process. I know a lot of people are scared to do it. That's another reason that steered me towards wanting to make this video. Instead of just pulling another engine, testing it, and putting that in the bike, this is what most people would do, is buy $100 worth of parts, refresh the whole top end, know all your oil seals are good, your piston rings are good, your head gasket's good, everything's gone through, adjusted properly. This is a really good kind of starting point now. This motor, in theory, should not have to be serviced for a long time. And that's what I like to send my customers away with, is a bike that I know is in good shape, and I'm not going to get a call a month later saying, it's starting to puke oil out of the head gasket or something crazy. So this one's all nice and taken care of. It is going to be a couple of weeks before I'm putting it back in the frame, just because I need to finish the rest of the modifications for the bike. So it's going to be a little while before we actually hear it run, but I'll make sure to take you guys along the way. I appreciate you watching. I'm sure this one was a long one. Let me know if you have any questions or anything in the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next one.